So here's something to think about as you settle in tonight. Right now, somewhere in the world, a machine is doing arithmetic. Not just one machine, billions of them, all at once, every single second. The phone on your nightstand, the servers humming in some windowless building in Virginia, the little chip inside your thermostat that decides when to kick the heat on. They're all counting, adding, subtracting, comparing numbers, shuffling ones and zeros around at speeds that would make your head spin if you really stopped to think about it. And the wild thing, the truly remarkable thing, is that every last one of those machines traces its ancestry back to a very simple, very human impulse: the desire to count without making mistakes. That's really where this whole story begins. Not with silicon, not with electricity, not even with gears. It begins with fingers. Think about the word digit for a second. We use it to mean a number, 0 through 9, the digits. But it also means a finger or a toe, and that's not a coincidence. The Latin word digitus meant finger, and the reason we have a base 10 number system at all, the reason 10 feels so natural and obvious to us, is simply that most humans happen to have 10 fingers. That's it. If we'd evolved with 8 fingers, we'd probably count in base 8 and think that was perfectly normal. The entire foundation of how we represent quantity in everyday life is, when you get right down to it, an accident of biology. And for a very long time, fingers were enough. If you're a shepherd in ancient Mesopotamia and you need to keep track of your flock, you can count on your fingers, maybe your toes, if the flock is big enough. But eventually, civilizations started getting more complex. Trade routes stretched longer, harvests got bigger, taxes needed collecting, and suddenly you needed to count things that went way beyond 20. You needed tools. The earliest counting tool we know about is almost disappointingly simple. It's a bone, the Ishango bone, found near the headwaters of the Nile in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, dates back roughly 20,000 years. It's a baboon fibula, the thin bone from the lower leg, with a series of notches carved into it in distinct groups. Now, there's been a lot of debate about what those notches actually mean. Some researchers think it's a tally stick, just someone keeping count of something. Others have argued it might be a lunar calendar, or even evidence of early prime number awareness, because some of the notch groupings correspond to primes. The honest answer is, we're not entirely sure. But what we do know is that someone, 20,000 years ago, felt the need to record numerical information on a physical object. They externalized counting. They moved it from their head to the world. And in a way, that's the first tiny step toward computing. Taking a mental process and offloading it onto something outside yourself. Fast forward a few thousand years and you start seeing more sophisticated tools. The abacus is the one everyone thinks of, and rightly so, because it's genuinely brilliant. The earliest known abacuses show up in Mesopotamia around 2700 to 2300 BCE, though the word itself comes from the Greek abax, meaning a flat surface or counting board. The basic idea is beautifully simple. You have beads or stones that slide along rods or grooves, and their position represents a value. Move a bead over on the one's rod, that's one. Fill up the one's rod, reset it, and move a bead on the tens rod. You're physically manipulating place value with your hands. Here's what's really clever about the abacus, though. It's not just a way to record numbers, it's a way to calculate with them. A skilled abacus operator can add, subtract, multiply, and divide with remarkable speed. There are competitions in Japan where abacus users, soroban practitioners they're called, go head-to-head against people using electronic calculators, and the abacus users sometimes win. Not because the abacus is faster than electronics, obviously, but because the human trained on the abacus has internalized the operations so deeply that their fingers move almost before they've consciously processed the problem. The tool reshapes the mind. That's a theme we're going to keep coming back to throughout this whole story. The way computing tools don't just help us think, they change how we think. Now, the abacus spread everywhere. Different cultures developed their own versions. The Chinese swanpan with its distinctive 2 and 5 bead arrangement, the Japanese soroban streamlined down to 1 and 4, the Russian shoti with its 10 beads per rod. Each one reflects slightly different mathematical traditions and preferences, but the core idea is the same. And these weren't toys or curiosities. They were essential business tools. For centuries, if you were a merchant, a tax collector, an engineer planning an irrigation system, the abacus was your computer. Literally. The word computer originally meant a person who computes, and for most of history, those people were using tools like the abacus to do their work. But let's pause here and think about what the abacus can't do. It's a wonderful tool for arithmetic, but it has no memory in any meaningful sense. When you finish a calculation and clear the beads, the work is gone. There's no way to store a sequence of operations, no way to say, do this, then do that, then do the other thing, and have the tool carry it out. Every step requires a human hand and a human mind directing it. The abacus is a calculator, not a computer in the modern sense, and the gap between those two things, between a tool that helps you calculate and a machine that can follow a sequence of instructions on its own, that gap is enormous. It took humanity thousands of years to cross it, so let's start walking toward that crossing. And the path takes us, maybe surprisingly, through the stars. Astronomy was one of the great mathematical obsessions of the ancient and medieval worlds, and for good reason. If you're a sailor, you navigate by the stars. If you're a farmer, you need to know when the seasons change. If you're a priest in almost any ancient culture, the movements of celestial bodies are deeply tied to religious practice and prophecy, and calculating the positions of planets and stars is hard. Really hard. It involves multiplying and dividing very large numbers, working with angles and trigonometric functions, doing the same kinds of calculations over and over with slightly different inputs. It's tedious, error-prone work, and the consequences of getting it wrong could be serious. A navigator who miscalculates his position might sail his ship onto rocks. This pressure to do complex calculations accurately drove a lot of early innovation. The astrolabe, for instance, which shows up in the Greek world around the 2nd century BCE and was refined extensively by Islamic scholars during the medieval period, is essentially an analog computer for astronomy. It's a beautiful brass disc with rotating plates and pointers that lets you model the positions of the sun and stars for any given time and latitude. You dial in your inputs by rotating the parts, and you read off the outputs from the engraved scales. It's solving spherical trigonometry problems mechanically without requiring the user to do the underlying math. An astrolabe doesn't look anything like what we think of as a computer, but functionally, it's doing the same thing, taking inputs, processing them through a fixed set of relationships, and producing outputs. The Antikythera mechanism is an even more striking example. This is one of my favorite stories in all of engineering history. In 1901, Greek sponge divers working off the coast of the tiny island of Antikythera between Crete and the Peloponnese discovered a Roman-era shipwreck. Among the corroded bronze statues and pottery, they found a lump of greenish calcified metal about the size of a shoebox. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for decades, mostly ignored, because nobody could figure out what it was. Then, in the 1950s and 60s, a British science historian named Derek de Solla Price started taking it seriously. He used X-ray imaging to peer inside the corroded mass, and what he found was astonishing. A complex system of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, with teeth cut at precise intervals, all designed to mesh together in specific ratios. It was, as Price eventually argued, a mechanical computer for predicting astronomical events. You turned a hand crank on the side, and the gears would calculate the positions of the sun and moon, predict lunar and solar eclipses, even track the cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. It dated to roughly 100 BCE, maybe a bit earlier. And the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Some of the gears had teeth, barely a millimeter apart, cut with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. Think about what that means. Over 2,000 years ago, someone in the Greek world, we still don't know exactly who, though there are theories connecting it to the tradition of Archimedes or to workshops on the island of Rhodes. Someone built a machine that could model the heavens mechanically. You gave it an input, a date essentially, and it computed the state of the sky. It had multiple outputs displayed on different dials. It even had a kind of user manual inscribed on its surfaces. It was, by any reasonable definition, an analog computer. And then the knowledge of how to build such things was lost. The Roman world didn't seem to carry the tradition forward, or if they did, none of those devices survived. The medieval European world certainly didn't have anything comparable for centuries. That's one of the sobering lessons of engineering history. Progress isn't always a straight line. Knowledge can be lost. Techniques can be forgotten. The Antikythera mechanism is a ghost from a future that didn't happen on schedule. A reminder that the story of computing could have gone very differently. But the impulse never really died. The need to calculate, to predict, to model the world in numbers, that kept reasserting itself across cultures and centuries. In medieval Islam, scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, whose name, by the way, gives us the word algorithm, developed systematic methods for solving equations that were essentially step-by-step computational procedures. His 9th century treatise on algebra laid out methods so clearly, so procedurally, that they could almost be followed mechanically. You take this number, you do this operation, you get this result, you feed it into the next step. That's algorithmic thinking, and it's one of the crucial intellectual ingredients that would eventually make true computing possible. Meanwhile, in the practical world, people kept inventing clever devices to make specific calculations easier. Napier's bones, invented by the Scottish mathematician John Napier around 1617, were a set of numbered rods that simplified multiplication by reducing it to addition. You'd line up the rods and read off partial products. Napier also invented logarithms, which might sound like a dry mathematical topic, but here's why they matter enormously for our story. Logarithms convert multiplication into addition. If you have a table of logarithms, you can multiply two large numbers by looking up their logs, adding those together, and then looking up the result in the table to get your answer. That's a huge deal when you're a navigator or an astronomer doing hundreds of multiplications a day. And logarithms led directly to one of the most successful analog computing devices ever made, the slide rule. William Oughtred, an English clergyman and mathematician, created the first slide rule around 1622 by placing two logarithmic scales next to each other so they could slide relative to one another. When you slide one scale against the other, you're physically adding logarithms, which means you're multiplying numbers. It's ingenious. And the slide rule would go on to be the essential tool of engineers and scientists for over 300 years. Every bridge, every building, every airplane designed before about 1970 was calculated, at least in part, on a slide rule. The engineers who put humans on the moon during the Apollo program used slide rules. There's something wonderful about that. This simple mechanical device, 2 sliding pieces of wood or bamboo with numbers printed on them, helping to design spacecraft. But all of these tools, the abacus, the astrolabe, Napier's bones, the slide rule, they all share a fundamental limitation. They require a human operator at every step. The human decides what operation to perform, physically manipulates the tool, reads the result, decides what to do next. The tool has no autonomy, no ability to follow a sequence of steps on its own. To get from here to what we'd recognize as a true computer, someone needed to imagine a machine that could be given a set of instructions and then execute them automatically, one after another, without a human hand guiding each individual step. And that idea, the idea of a programmable machine, didn't come from mathematics at all. It came from weaving. Specifically, it came from a French silk weaver named Joseph-Marie Jacquard, working in Lyon at the very beginning of the 19th century. And what Jacquard figured out, with his punched cards and his automatic loom, would plant a seed that would eventually grow into the entire architecture of modern computing. So let's talk about Jacquard and his loom, because this story is richer than most people realize. Lyon, in the late 1700s, was the silk capital of Europe. The city's economy revolved around weaving, and the most prized fabrics were brocades, these incredibly intricate patterned silks with images of flowers, birds, landscapes woven directly into the cloth. They were stunning, and they were brutally difficult to make. To produce a complex pattern, you needed a device called a draw loom, and operating a draw loom required 2 people. The weaver sat at the loom and threw the shuttle back and forth, but up above, often perched on top of the loom itself, sat a second person, usually a young boy, called the draw boy. The draw boy's job was to pull specific sets of threads upward at exactly the right moment, so the shuttle would pass over some threads and under others, creating the pattern. Every single row of the fabric required the draw boy to pull a different combination of threads, and a complex brocade might have thousands of rows, each one different. The draw boy had to follow instructions, usually called out to him or read from a paper chart, and he had to get it right every time. One mistake, one wrong thread pulled, and the pattern would have a visible flaw. You can imagine how slow and error-prone this was. The draw boys were often children, sometimes as young as 8 or 9, and they'd be working all day in these cramped positions on top of the looms. It was exhausting, tedious work, and the whole process was expensive because you essentially needed 2 skilled workers for every loom. And here's what's interesting. Several inventors before Jacquard had already tried to automate the draw boy's job. A man named Basile Bouchon had experimented with perforated paper tape as early as 1725, and another inventor, Jacques de Vaucanson, who was famous for building astonishing automata, including a mechanical duck that appeared to eat and digest grain. Vaucanson had built a partially automated loom in the 1740s using a metal cylinder with holes punched in it, kind of like a music box. But Vaucanson's loom was expensive, fragile, and never really caught on. Jacquard took these earlier ideas and refined them into something practical. He was born in 1752, the son of a weaver, and he knew the trade intimately. He'd seen the draw boys struggling, he understood the economics, and he spent years tinkering. His key innovation, which he demonstrated publicly around 1804, was a system of sturdy pasteboard cards, stiff rectangular cards with holes punched in specific positions. Each card controlled one row of the pattern. The cards were laced together in a long chain, and as the loom operated, the cards would advance one by one over a mechanism at the top of the loom. Where there was a hole in the card, a hook could pass through and lift a thread. Where the card was solid, the hook was blocked and the thread stayed down. So the pattern was literally encoded in the cards. You could change the entire design just by swapping in a different set of cards. The same loom could weave flowers one day and geometric patterns the next. Now think about what that means. The loom is reading instructions from an external medium. The cards are a program. The loom is a machine that executes that program automatically, step by step, without a human deciding at each moment what to do. The drawboy has been replaced by cardboard. And this is a genuinely profound conceptual leap, even though Jacquard himself probably didn't think of it in those terms. He was trying to make weaving faster and cheaper, not invent the idea of programmable machinery. But that's often how the biggest ideas enter the world. Sideways, through practical problems, carried by people who are just trying to make something work a little better. The Jacquard loom was a massive commercial success. By 1812, there were something like 11,000 of them operating in France. The silk weavers of Lyon initially rioted against the machines, fearing for their livelihoods, and honestly, they weren't wrong to be worried, because the looms did eliminate the drawboy's job entirely. But the technology spread anyway, because the economics were overwhelming. And here's a detail I love. One of the most famous demonstrations of the Jacquard loom's capability was a woven portrait of Jacquard himself, produced around 1839 by the firm of Michel and Carquillat. This portrait used approximately 24,000 cards to encode the image. 24,000 rows of instructions, each one specifying exactly which threads to raise and which to leave down, producing a woven image so detailed it looked almost like an engraving. Charles Babbage, who we're about to talk about, owned one of these portraits and was reportedly fascinated by it. He hung it in his drawing room and used it to explain his ideas to visitors. And that brings us to Babbage, because here's where the story of computing really accelerates. Charles Babbage is one of those figures who was so far ahead of his time that his contemporaries couldn't fully grasp what he was proposing. And even today, people argue about exactly how much credit he deserves. He was born in London in 1791, the son of a wealthy banker, and from an early age he was obsessed with mathematics and, particularly, with the problem of errors in mathematical tables. This might sound like a minor concern, but in the early 19th century, mathematical tables were absolutely critical infrastructure. Navigation, astronomy, engineering, insurance, taxation, all of it depended on printed tables of logarithms, trigonometric functions, astronomical positions. And these tables were full of errors. They were calculated by hand, by teams of human computers. That's actually where the word computer comes from. It originally meant a person who computes, and then they were typeset by hand and printed. Errors crept in at every stage. A navigator at sea using a faulty logarithm table could miscalculate his position and wreck his ship on rocks. This wasn't a theoretical problem. People died because of errors in mathematical tables. Babbage wanted to eliminate those errors by mechanizing the entire process, not just the calculation, but the printing too, so there'd be no chance of a typesetting mistake. And around 1822, he conceived of a machine he called the difference engine. The core idea was based on a mathematical technique called the method of finite differences, which is a way of computing polynomial functions using only addition. You don't need multiplication or division, just repeated addition. And addition is relatively easy to mechanize with gears. Each gear wheel represents a digit, and when one wheel completes a full rotation, it carries over to the next wheel, just like an odometer in a car. Babbage's insight was that by arranging columns of these gear wheels and having them add their values to adjacent columns in the right sequence, you could automatically generate successive values of a polynomial, which meant you could tabulate logarithms, trigonometric functions, all sorts of useful mathematical tables, all without human intervention after the initial setup. He built a small working demonstration model, and it was impressive enough that the British government agreed to fund the construction of a full-scale difference engine. This was 1823, and the government eventually invested around £17,000, an enormous sum at the time, equivalent to the cost of building a couple of warships. But the project ran into terrible difficulties. The precision required for the gears and linkages was at the absolute edge of what 19th century manufacturing could achieve. Babbage kept changing the design, demanding tighter tolerances, arguing with his chief engineer, a brilliant toolmaker named Joseph Clement. The project dragged on for years, costs ballooned, and eventually, around 1833, the government pulled the plug. The difference engine was never completed in Babbage's lifetime. But here's the thing. By the time the difference engine project collapsed, Babbage had already conceived of something far more ambitious. Something that, if he'd been able to build it, would have been recognizable as a genuine general-purpose computer more than a century before the first electronic computers were built. He called it the analytical engine, and this is where Jacquard's punched cards come back into the story. The analytical engine, which Babbage worked on from roughly 1834 until his death in 1871, was designed to be programmable using punched cards, directly inspired by the Jacquard loom. But where Jacquard's cards controlled which threads to lift, Babbage's cards would control mathematical operations. He envisioned two types of cards: operation cards, which told the machine what to do, add, subtract, multiply, divide, and variable cards, which told the machine where to find the numbers to operate on and where to store the results. The machine would have a store, which was essentially memory, a set of columns of gear wheels holding numbers, and a mill, which was the processing unit where arithmetic actually happened. Numbers would be transferred from the store to the mill, operated on according to the instructions on the cards, and the results sent back to the store. If this sounds familiar, it should. A store and a mill, memory and a processor, input through punched cards, the ability to perform any arithmetic operation in any sequence. The analytical engine, had it been built, would have had the fundamental architecture that all modern computers share. Babbage even envisioned conditional branching. The machine could be designed to skip forward or backward in its sequence of cards, depending on the result of a calculation. If a number was positive, do one thing. If negative, do another. That's an if-then statement. That's what makes a computer fundamentally different from a calculator. A calculator does what you tell it, step by step. A computer can make decisions. And now we need to talk about Ada Lovelace because the story of the analytical engine is incomplete without her. Augusta Ada King, Countess of Lovelace, was the daughter of Lord Byron, the poet, though she never really knew her father. Her mother, Lady Byron, was terrified that Ada might inherit her father's wild, romantic temperament and pushed her toward mathematics and science as a kind of antidote. It worked in a sense. Ada turned out to be brilliant at mathematics, though she was also imaginative and poetic in her thinking, which turned out to be exactly the right combination. Ada met Babbage at a party in 1833 when she was just 17, and she was immediately captivated by his difference engine demonstration model. Over the following years, she became deeply involved in understanding the analytical engine. In 1842, an Italian mathematician named Luigi Menabrea published a description of the analytical engine based on lectures Babbage had given in Turin. Ada translated this paper from French into English, and at Babbage's encouragement, she added her own extensive notes that ended up being about 3 times longer than the original paper. These notes are extraordinary. In them, Ada described how the analytical engine could be instructed to compute Bernoulli numbers, a complex sequence in mathematics, and she laid out, step by step, the operations the machine would need to perform. This is widely considered the first computer program ever written, and it's why Ada Lovelace is often called the first computer programmer. But what's even more remarkable, to my mind, is the conceptual clarity she brought to the discussion. She understood, perhaps more clearly than Babbage himself, the distinction between what the machine could do and what it couldn't. She wrote that the engine had no pretensions to originate anything. It could only do whatever we know how to order it to perform. That's a statement about the nature of computation that remains relevant today, in the age of artificial intelligence. She also saw possibilities that Babbage hadn't fully articulated. She speculated that the engine might be used to compose music, produce graphics, and manipulate symbols beyond just numbers, if those symbols could be represented in a way the machine could process. She was imagining, in 1843, the idea of a general-purpose symbol processing machine. That's essentially what every computer is. Ada Lovelace died of cancer in 1852, at just 36. Babbage kept working on the analytical engine until his own death in 1871, but he never secured the funding to build it. The machine existed only in his incredibly detailed plans and drawings, thousands of pages of them, and for a long time, the significance of what Babbage and Lovelace had envisioned was largely forgotten. The plans gathered dust, and the world moved on to other approaches. But the punched card didn't disappear. It found a new champion and a new purpose in a completely different context, the United States Census. By the 1880s, the U.S. population was growing so fast that the census was becoming an administrative nightmare. The 1880 census had taken nearly 8 years to fully tabulate, and projections suggested the 1890 census might not be finished before the 1900 census was due to begin. Something had to change, and a young engineer at the Census Bureau named Herman Hollerith had an idea. Hollerith had studied engineering at Columbia University, and he'd worked on the 1880 census, so he understood the problem firsthand. And what he proposed was a system built around punched cards, but not Jacquard's kind exactly. Hollerith's insight was to use cards not as instructions for a machine to follow, but as data storage. Each card would represent one person, and the holes punched into that card would encode information about that person: their age, their sex, their state of residence, their occupation, their marital status. You'd punch holes in specific positions on the card, and each position corresponded to a particular piece of data. So a hole in one spot might mean male, a hole in another spot might mean born in New York, and so on. The genius was in what happened next. You'd feed that card into a machine called a tabulating machine, and the machine would read the holes using small metal pins. Each pin would press down against the card, and wherever there was a hole, the pin would pass through and make contact with a small cup of mercury underneath. That completed an electrical circuit, and that electrical signal would advance a mechanical counter by 1. So if you were counting how many people in the census lived in Ohio, every time a card with a hole in the Ohio position passed through the machine, the Ohio counter would tick up by 1. Think about what that means. Instead of clerks manually tallying marks in ledger books for months and years on end, you could feed cards through a machine and have it count automatically. And you could sort the cards too. Hollerith designed a sorting box that would pop open the correct compartment based on what the card said, so you could physically separate cards into categories and then run them through again for more detailed breakdowns. It was, in essence, a mechanical database query system powered by electricity in 1890. Hollerith entered his system in a competition the Census Bureau held in 1889. They tested 3 different approaches, and Hollerith's was dramatically faster. His system could process cards roughly 10 times faster than the manual methods. He won the contract, and the 1890 census became the first to use electrical tabulating machines. The results were extraordinary. The basic population count, about 62.9 million people, was completed in just 6 weeks. The full detailed tabulation took about 2 years, compared to the 8 years the 1880 census had required. And the population had grown significantly in that decade, so the improvement was even more impressive than the raw numbers suggest. Now Hollerith was a sharp businessman, as well as a good engineer. He patented his machines and his cards, and he didn't sell the equipment to the Census Bureau. He leased it. That's a business model that might sound familiar. He charged per card processed, and he controlled the supply of blank cards. This made him quite wealthy, but it also made the Census Bureau increasingly frustrated with his prices. By the time the 1900 census came around, they were paying Hollerith considerably more, and there was real tension. After the 1900 census, the Bureau actually developed their own tabulating machines in-house, partly to break free from Hollerith's grip. There was a bitter legal battle, and Hollerith eventually lost the census contract. But here's the thing, the census was just the beginning. Hollerith realized that his tabulating machines could be useful for any large organization that needed to process lots of data. Insurance companies, railroads, retail chains, government agencies, anyone dealing with large numbers of records. He founded the Tabulating Machine Company in 1896, and it grew steadily. In 1911, it merged with several other companies to form a conglomerate called the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, or CTR. And in 1924, a man named Thomas Watson Sr. renamed that company. He called it International Business Machines, IBM. That's the direct lineage, from Hollerith's census cards to one of the most important technology companies in history. And those punched cards became ubiquitous. For decades, they were the primary way data was stored and processed in business and government. The standard IBM card, 80 columns, 12 rows, became so common that an entire infrastructure grew around it. If you've ever heard the phrase, "do not fold, spindle, or mutilate," that was printed on punched cards. They were everywhere. And the basic idea, encoding data as patterns of holes that a machine could read, persisted well into the 1970s and even the 1980s in some places. Babbage's variable cards and operation cards had been about programming, about telling a machine what to do. Hollerith's cards were about data, about giving a machine information to process. Both ideas would eventually merge in the modern computer. But for a long time, they developed along somewhat separate tracks. So let's pause on Hollerith for a moment and think about where we are in the story. By the end of the 19th century, we have the conceptual blueprint for a general-purpose computer. That's Babbage and Lovelace. We have a practical, proven technology for automated data processing using punched cards and electrical circuits. That's Hollerith. What we don't yet have is the theoretical framework that ties it all together. We don't have a rigorous mathematical answer to the question, what can a machine actually compute? What are the fundamental limits? And that question, which sounds abstract, almost philosophical, turns out to be one of the most important questions anyone has ever asked about machines. The answer came from a quiet, awkward, brilliant mathematician named Alan Turing, and his story is one of the most remarkable and most heartbreaking in the entire history of science. Turing was born in London in 1912. He was clearly gifted from a young age, the kind of child who taught himself to read in 3 weeks and who was fascinated by numbers and puzzles and how things worked. But he was also shy, socially awkward, and didn't fit neatly into the English public school system, which valued conformity and athletics as much as intellect. He found a close friend in another student named Christopher Morcom, and when Morcom died suddenly of tuberculosis in 1930, the loss affected Turing deeply. Some historians think it pushed him toward questions about the nature of mind and mechanism, whether a person's thought processes could somehow be captured or replicated. Turing went to King's College, Cambridge, and then to Princeton, and in 1936, at just 24 years old, he published a paper that changed everything. The paper had the rather dry title, On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem. The Entscheidungsproblem, that's German for decision problem, was a challenge posed by the mathematician David Hilbert. Hilbert had asked whether there existed a general procedure, an algorithm, that could determine the truth or falsity of any mathematical statement. It's a beautiful question. Can you build a machine, even a theoretical one, that can solve any well-posed math problem? Turing's answer was no. But the way he got to that answer is what matters for our story, because in order to prove what couldn't be computed, he first had to define precisely what computation itself was. And to do that, he invented a thought experiment, an imaginary machine, that we now call a Turing machine. Here's how to picture it. Imagine an infinitely long strip of tape divided into squares. Each square can hold a symbol, let's say a 0, a 1, or it can be blank. There's a read-write head that sits over one square at a time. The head can read the symbol on the current square, write a new symbol, and then move one square to the left or one square to the right. And there's a set of rules, a table of instructions, that tells the head what to do based on 2 things: what symbol it's currently reading and what internal state the machine is currently in. That's it. That's the whole machine. A tape, a head, and a rule table. It sounds almost absurdly simple. But here's what's wild about this. Turing proved that this simple machine, given the right set of instructions, could compute anything that any mechanical process could compute. Any calculation, any algorithm, any logical procedure that you could describe in a finite number of steps, a Turing machine could do it. And he went further. He showed that you could build a single Turing machine, a universal Turing machine, that could simulate any other Turing machine. You just encode the other machine's instructions on the tape as data, and the universal machine would read those instructions and execute them. Think about what that means. The universal Turing machine is a machine that takes programs as input. It's a machine whose behavior is entirely determined by the instructions you feed it. That's a computer. That's the abstract mathematical essence of every computer that has ever existed or ever will exist. Your laptop, your phone, the servers running the internet. They're all, at their theoretical core, implementations of Turing's universal machine. More powerful, faster, with vastly more memory, but fundamentally doing the same thing, reading instructions and data, processing them according to rules, and producing output. And the beautiful, almost paradoxical thing is that Turing invented this concept not to show what machines could do, but to show what they couldn't. He used the universal Turing machine to prove that certain problems are undecidable. There's no algorithm that can solve them in all cases. The most famous is the halting problem. Given a program and an input, can you determine in advance whether the program will eventually stop or run forever? Turing proved that no general algorithm can do this. There are fundamental limits to computation, walls that no machine, no matter how powerful, can break through. Now, Turing published this paper in 1936, and it's worth noting that he wasn't the only one thinking along these lines. Alonzo Church, an American mathematician at Princeton, who was actually Turing's doctoral advisor, had arrived at essentially the same conclusion about the Entscheidungs problem a few months earlier, using a completely different mathematical framework called lambda calculus. The fact that two very different approaches led to the same answer gave everyone confidence that they'd found something real, something fundamental about the nature of computation itself. This convergence is now called the Church-Turing thesis, and it says, roughly, that any function that can be computed by any reasonable mechanical process can be computed by a Turing machine. It's not a theorem you can prove. It's more like a definition of what computable means, and no one has ever found a counterexample. But Turing's paper was pure theory. It was about abstract machines on infinite tapes. The question of whether you could actually build a real, physical machine that worked on these principles, that was a different challenge entirely. And the answer to that question came, as so many technological leaps do, from war. By 1939, Europe was plunging into the Second World War, and Britain faced a terrifying problem. The German military was communicating using a cipher machine called Enigma. You've probably heard of it. Enigma looked like a typewriter in a wooden box, but inside it had a series of rotating wheels, rotors, wired in complex ways. When you pressed a key, electrical current would flow through the rotors, each one scrambling the signal in a different way, and a different letter would light up on a display panel. That was your encrypted letter. The rotors would then advance, changing the scrambling pattern, so the next time you pressed the same key, a completely different letter would come out. The number of possible settings was astronomical, on the order of 159 million, depending on the version. The Germans believed Enigma was unbreakable. Turing was recruited to Bletchley Park, a Victorian estate about 50 miles north of London that became the center of Britain's code-breaking effort. He arrived in September 1939, the day after war was declared, and he threw himself into the problem of cracking Enigma. Now, the Polish mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski, had actually broken earlier versions of Enigma before the war, and they shared their work with the British and French just weeks before Poland was invaded. That was an extraordinary act of generosity and foresight, and it gave Turing and his colleagues a crucial head start. But the Germans had increased Enigma's complexity, and the old Polish methods no longer worked. Turing designed a new machine to attack the problem, an electromechanical device called the bomb. The bomb wasn't a computer in the modern sense. It didn't store programs or process general-purpose instructions. It was a special-purpose machine designed to do one thing: test enormous numbers of possible enigma settings very quickly, looking for contradictions that would eliminate wrong answers. It exploited a known weakness. Enigma could never encrypt a letter as itself. If you pressed A, you might get any letter except A. That tiny constraint, combined with educated guesses about what the original messages might contain, these guesses were called cribs, gave the bomb enough of a foothold to work. The first bomb was installed at Bletchley Park in March 1940, and as the war went on, hundreds more were built. The intelligence they produced, codenamed Ultra, was one of the Allies' most closely guarded secrets, and by many estimates, shortened the war by at least 2 years. That's millions of lives. And Turing was at the center of it. This awkward, eccentric genius who would chain his coffee mug to a radiator so no one would steal it, who would sometimes wear a gas mask while cycling to work to ward off hay fever, and who was quietly doing work of incalculable importance that he could never tell anyone about. But even while the war was raging, Turing was thinking beyond Enigma. He was thinking about building a real, programmable, general-purpose computing machine, the kind of universal machine he'd described in his 1936 paper, but made of actual hardware. And he wasn't the only one. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of machine was already taking shape, born from a very different set of pressures, and it was about to change everything. It was called ENIAC, and the pressures that brought it into existence had nothing to do with code breaking and everything to do with ballistics. See, here's a problem you might not think about. When the United States military fires an artillery shell, that shell doesn't travel in a straight line. It arcs through the air, affected by gravity, wind speed, air density, the temperature of the propellant, the rotation of the Earth, even the altitude of the firing position relative to the target. And if you want that shell to land where you intend it to, you need a firing table, a massive chart that tells the gunner exactly what angle to set the barrel at for a given distance, given all those variables. During World War II, the U.S. Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland was responsible for computing these tables. And I mean computing in the old sense. Human beings, mostly women with mathematics degrees, sitting at desks with mechanical calculators, grinding through differential equations by hand. They were called computers. That was literally the job title. Each firing table required thousands of individual trajectory calculations, and each trajectory could take a skilled human computer about 30 hours to complete. The Army needed hundreds of new firing tables, and they needed them fast because new weapons were being deployed constantly, and the existing tables couldn't keep up. They were falling behind. Weapons were reaching the front lines without accurate firing data, which is a terrifying thought if you're the soldier pulling the trigger. So in 1943, a physicist named John Mauchly and a young engineer named J. Presper Eckert, both at the University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Electrical Engineering, proposed something audacious. They wanted to build an electronic machine that could compute a single trajectory in about 30 seconds instead of 30 hours. Not electromechanical, like the bomb with its spinning rotors and relay switches. Fully electronic, using vacuum tubes, those glass bulbs you might associate with old radios, where electrons flow through a vacuum between heated elements. Vacuum tubes could switch on and off thousands of times per second, vastly faster than any mechanical relay. The Army said yes. The project was codenamed Project PX, and the machine would be called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. Now, let's talk about what they were actually attempting here, because the scale of it was genuinely unprecedented. ENIAC used about 17,468 vacuum tubes. That number alone should make you pause. Vacuum tubes were notoriously unreliable. They burned out constantly. Think of how often a light bulb blows, and then imagine you need nearly 18,000 of them all working at the same time. The conventional wisdom at the time was that a machine with that many tubes would never run long enough to finish a useful calculation before something failed. Eckert, who was the chief engineer and a meticulous, almost obsessively detail-oriented person, tackled this problem head-on. He ran every tube below its rated voltage, which reduced performance slightly but dramatically extended lifespan. He designed circuits that could tolerate some degradation. He instituted rigorous testing protocols where tubes were burned in and stressed before installation, weeding out the weak ones early. And it worked. Not perfectly. Tubes still failed, and the maintenance team got very good at finding and replacing them quickly, but well enough that ENIAC could run for hours, sometimes days, between failures. ENIAC was enormous. It filled an entire room, roughly 30 by 50 feet, weighed about 30 tons, and consumed around 150 kilowatts of power. There's this famous story, probably exaggerated but rooted in truth, that when ENIAC was switched on, the lights in an entire section of Philadelphia dimmed. Whether or not that's literally accurate, it gives you a sense of the thing's appetite for electricity and the heat. Imagine nearly 18,000 vacuum tubes all glowing at once. The room required its own dedicated cooling system. Here's the thing about ENIAC, though, and this is important for understanding where computing was headed. ENIAC was not a stored program computer. It didn't read its instructions from memory the way your phone or laptop does. To program ENIAC, you had to physically reconfigure it. You had to set thousands of switches by hand and plug cables into patch panels, essentially rewiring the machine for each new problem. This could take days. The actual computation might finish in seconds, but the setup was a laborious, painstaking process. And the people who did that work, the people who figured out how to translate a mathematical problem into a physical configuration of switches and cables, were 6 women: Kay McNulty, Betty Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marlon Meltzer, Fran Bilas, and Ruth Lichterman. They were the original ENIAC programmers, and for decades their contributions were largely overlooked. They weren't just plugging in cables mindlessly. They had to understand the machine's architecture deeply, break complex equations into sequences of operations, debug problems, and invent programming techniques from scratch, because no one had ever done this before. There was no manual. There was no precedent. They figured it out. ENIAC wasn't completed until late 1945, after the war had ended, so it never fulfilled its original purpose of computing wartime firing tables. But it was put to work immediately on other problems, including calculations for the hydrogen bomb. And its real legacy wasn't the specific computations it performed. It was the proof of concept. ENIAC demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that large-scale electronic computing was possible, that you could build a machine with thousands of vacuum tubes and it would actually work. But even before ENIAC was finished, the people involved were already thinking about what came next, and this is where things get really fascinating. In 1944, a mathematician named John von Neumann got involved with the ENIAC project. Von Neumann was, by almost any measure, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. He made foundational contributions to quantum mechanics, game theory, set theory, economics, and nuclear physics. He could multiply 8-digit numbers in his head. He had a photographic memory and could recite entire books verbatim years after reading them. He was also charismatic, sociable, loved parties, told jokes, and drove his car terribly. a very different personality from the solitary, introverted Turing. Von Neumann looked at ENIAC and immediately saw both its power and its limitation. The limitation was the programming problem. The fact that you had to physically rewire the machine for every new task. And the solution, he realized, was something Turing had essentially described in 1936. Store the program in the machine's own memory, right alongside the data. Treat instructions and data as the same kind of thing. A program is just a sequence of numbers, after all. Store it electronically, and the machine can read its own instructions at electronic speed, modify them, branch between them, loop through them, all without anyone touching a cable. Von Neumann wrote up this idea in a document known as the First Draft of a Report on the EDVAC in June 1945. EDVAC, the Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer, was the planned successor to ENIAC, and this report laid out what we now call the von Neumann architecture, a processing unit, a control unit, memory that holds both data and instructions, and input-output mechanisms. This is, in its essentials, still the architecture of the device you're listening to right now. Your phone, your laptop, the servers that stream your music, they're all descendants of this basic blueprint. Now, here's where it gets complicated and a little contentious. Von Neumann's name was the only one on that report. Mauchly and Eckert, who had been developing many of these ideas themselves and had concrete engineering plans for the stored program concept, felt that von Neumann had taken credit for their work. The dispute was bitter and lasted years. It tangled up patent rights, academic reputations, and personal relationships. The truth, as is usually the case with invention, is messy. The stored program concept had multiple parents. Turing had described it abstractly in 1936. Eckert and Mauchly had been moving toward it through practical engineering. Von Neumann synthesized and formalized it with extraordinary clarity. And Konrad Zuse, working in isolation in wartime Germany, had built programmable computers, the Z3 in 1941, that while not stored program machines in the full sense, were remarkably advanced for their time and place. Zuse's work was largely unknown to the Americans and British until after the war, which is one of those strange, sad footnotes of history. Brilliant work done in a vacuum, literally and figuratively. But the stored program idea was now out there, clearly articulated, and the race was on to build one. And this race played out on both sides of the Atlantic simultaneously. In Manchester, England, a small team including Frederick Williams and Tom Kilburn built what's generally considered the first machine to run a stored program from electronic memory. It was called the Manchester Baby, officially the small-scale experimental machine, and on June 21st, 1948, it executed its first program, a simple routine to find the highest proper factor of a number. The program was just 17 instructions long. It took 52 minutes to run, doing something a human could have done in moments. But that wasn't the point. The point was that the instructions lived in the machine's memory, stored as patterns of electric charge on a cathode ray tube, and the machine read them, executed them, and produced the right answer. That was the moment. That was the threshold. And Turing himself was deeply involved in this world. After the war, he joined the National Physical Laboratory in London, where he designed the automatic computing engine, the ACE. His design was remarkably detailed and, in some ways, more sophisticated than what von Neumann had outlined. But Turing was difficult to work with in an institutional setting. He was impatient with bureaucracy, didn't always explain his thinking clearly to colleagues, and the project moved slowly. A simplified version, the Pilot Ace, eventually ran in 1950, and it was one of the fastest computers in the world at the time. But by then, Turing had already moved on to Manchester, where he worked on the Manchester Mark I, the full-scale successor to the Baby. And his mind was already wandering toward something else entirely, something that wouldn't become a major field for decades. He was thinking about whether machines could think, whether a computer could exhibit genuine intelligence. In 1950, he published a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, in which he proposed what's now called the Turing test, the idea that if a machine could carry on a conversation so convincingly that a human judge couldn't distinguish it from a real person, then for all practical purposes, you'd have to grant that the machine was thinking. It was a provocative idea then, and it's still a provocative idea now. Think about it. Turing wasn't asking whether a machine could feel emotions or have a soul or experience consciousness the way philosophers had been arguing about for centuries. He sidestepped all of that. He basically said, look, if you can't tell the difference, then the distinction doesn't matter. It was a deeply pragmatic move from someone trained in mathematics, and it reframed the whole question in a way that people are still debating today. Every time a chatbot surprises them, or an AI generates something that feels a little too human. Turing saw all of that coming in 1950, when most computers still filled entire rooms and could barely do long division at a reasonable speed. But Turing's story doesn't end with triumph, and this is one of those parts of computing history that you need to sit with for a moment, because it matters. In 1952, Turing was prosecuted by the British government for homosexuality, which was still a criminal offense in England at the time. He was convicted and given a choice between prison and chemical castration, hormone treatments designed to suppress his sexuality. He chose the hormones. The treatment was brutal. And on June 7, 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home, a half-eaten apple beside him, poisoned with cyanide. He was 41 years old. The official ruling was suicide, though some people close to him believed it might have been accidental. He was known to be careless with chemicals in his home experiments. Either way, the world lost one of the most original minds of the 20th century, a man who had arguably done as much as anyone to win the war, and then helped invent the intellectual framework for the entire digital age. It took until 2013 for the British government to issue a formal royal pardon. That's how long it took. So when you use a computer, when you talk to a voice assistant, when you hear someone mention artificial intelligence, Turing is in the foundations of all of it. And the way his life ended is a reminder that the history of technology is never just about technology. It's about people and the societies they live in, and the ways those societies can be spectacularly wrong about what matters. Now, let's take a breath and talk about what happened next in the world of computing, because the early 1950s were a period of incredible acceleration. You had these room-filling machines, ENIAC, the Manchester Mark I, the Pilot Ace, EDSAC at Cambridge, and they were all built around vacuum tubes. Thousands and thousands of vacuum tubes. And here's the thing about vacuum tubes. They work, but they're fragile, they're hot, they're power-hungry, and they burn out constantly. Running ENIAC was like managing a small city's worth of light bulbs. The maintenance teams spent more time replacing blown tubes than actually computing. So the question everyone was asking, even as these first-generation computers were being built, was, is there something better? And the answer had already been invented. On December 23, 1947, just a few months before the Manchester Baby ran its first program. 3 researchers at Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey demonstrated a tiny device that would change everything. Their names were John Bardeen, Walter Bratton, and William Shockley, and the device was the transistor. Now, a transistor does essentially the same job as a vacuum tube. It can amplify a signal or act as a switch, turning current on and off. But it does it with a tiny piece of semiconductor material, usually germanium in those early days, later silicon. No glowing filament, no vacuum, no glass envelope. Just a small sliver of crystal with some clever doping. That's the term for introducing impurities into the semiconductor to change its electrical properties. The result was a switch that was smaller, faster, more reliable, used far less power, and generated far less heat than a vacuum tube. It was, in every measurable way, better. But here's what's interesting. The transistor didn't immediately revolutionize computing. These things take time. The first transistors were finicky, expensive to manufacture, and not always reliable enough for the demanding work of digital computation. Through the early and mid-1950s, computers were still being built with vacuum tubes. The IBM 701, which came out in 1952 and was one of IBM's first commercial scientific computers, used vacuum tubes. So did the IBM 704, which followed in 1954. These were serious machines. The 704 could do about 40,000 floating-point operations per second, which was remarkable for the time. But they were still fundamentally first-generation technology, still wrestling with the heat and reliability problems that came with tubes. The transition to transistors in computing happened gradually and then all at once. One of the key early transistorized computers was the TX-0, built at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory around 1956. It was a research machine meant to explore what was possible with transistor-based design. But the real watershed moment for commercial computing came in 1959, when IBM released the 7090. This was a fully transistorized mainframe, and it was blazingly fast compared to its vacuum tube predecessors, roughly 6 times faster than the 709 it replaced. And it was more reliable because transistors didn't burn out the way tubes did. Suddenly, you could run a computer for hours, days, without something failing. That changed what computers could be used for. It meant you could trust them with longer, more complex calculations. You could start thinking about them as tools for business, not just scientific curiosities. And speaking of business, let's talk about IBM for a moment, because by the late 1950s, IBM was becoming the dominant force in computing. And the way they got there is a fascinating story in itself. Remember Herman Hollerith and his punch card machines from the census? That company eventually became IBM in 1924 under the leadership of Thomas Watson Sr. Watson was a legendary salesman, intense, demanding, almost cult-like in the corporate culture he built. IBM salesmen wore dark suits, white shirts, and ties. They didn't drink alcohol. They sang company songs. It sounds almost absurd now. But Watson understood something crucial. He wasn't just selling machines. He was selling trust. When a company bought an IBM system, they were buying the confidence that it would work, that IBM would support it, and that they were making the safe choice. That reputation carried IBM from punch cards into electronic computing with enormous momentum. By the early 1960s, IBM controlled something like 70% of the computer market. Their machines were everywhere, in banks, insurance companies, universities, government agencies, airlines. But they had a problem. They had too many different product lines, each incompatible with the others. Software written for one IBM machine wouldn't run on another. Customers who wanted to upgrade had to essentially start over. It was a mess, and IBM's competitors were starting to exploit the cracks. So IBM made one of the boldest bets in the history of business. In April 1964, they announced the System/360, an entire family of computers, from small to large, that were all compatible with each other. Same instruction set, same peripherals, same software. You could start with a small 360 and grow into a bigger one without rewriting everything. This sounds obvious now, but at the time, it was revolutionary, and it was terrifyingly expensive. IBM spent about $5 billion developing the System/360. That's roughly $45 billion in today's money. It was the largest privately funded commercial project in history up to that point. Larger than the Manhattan Project, if you adjust for inflation. Tom Watson Jr., who had taken over from his father, essentially bet the entire company on it. And it worked. The System/360 was a massive success. It defined the mainframe era and its architectural ideas, the notion of a compatible family of machines, the separation of architecture from implementation, influenced computer design for decades. When people talk about IBM in its golden age, this is what they mean. The 360 was the machine that made computing a standard part of how businesses operated, not an exotic experiment. But here's what's really fascinating about this period. While IBM was dominating the mainframe world, something much smaller and arguably more important was happening in the background. Because the transistor, as transformative as it was just the beginning. The real revolution was figuring out how to put many transistors together on a single piece of material. And that idea, the integrated circuit, came from two people working independently, almost simultaneously, in one of those strange coincidences that history seems to love. The first was Jack Kilby, an engineer at Texas Instruments. In the summer of 1958, Kilby was a new hire, and because he hadn't accrued any vacation time, he was one of the few people working during the company's mass vacation shutdown in July. Alone in the lab with time to think, he had an idea. What if you could build all the components of an electronic circuit, transistors, resistors, capacitors, out of the same block of semiconductor material? Instead of wiring together dozens of separate components, you'd fabricate them all on one chip. He built a rough prototype on a piece of germanium and demonstrated it to his bosses in September 1958. It worked. It was ugly. Wires sticking out everywhere, hand-connected. But it worked. Meanwhile, about 1,000 miles away in Mountain View, California, a physicist named Robert Noyce was thinking along very similar lines. Noyce was at Fairchild Semiconductor, a company that had been founded just a year earlier by 8 engineers who had left Shockley's Semiconductor Laboratory. Yes, the same William Shockley who co-invented the transistor. Shockley was brilliant but reportedly impossible to work for. Paranoid, demanding, erratic. So 8 of his best people walked out and started their own company. They were called the Traitorous 8, and Fairchild Semiconductor became one of the most important companies in the history of technology. Noyce's version of the integrated circuit, which he developed in early 1959, was different from Kilby's in a crucial way. Noyce used a planar process, building the components and their connections in flat layers on a silicon wafer with no hand-wired connections. It was cleaner, more manufacturable, more practical. And it was this approach, Noyce's approach, that became the foundation for how integrated circuits are actually made today. Both Kilby and Noyce are credited as co-inventors of the integrated circuit, and Kilby received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2000. Noyce had died in 1990, and the Nobel isn't awarded posthumously, but his contribution is universally recognized. Now, here's why the integrated circuit matters so much, and why it's worth spending a moment really letting this sink in. Before the integrated circuit, making a computer more powerful meant adding more components, more transistors, more wires, more connections. Every connection was a potential point of failure. Every wire had to be soldered by hand. There was a practical limit to how complex you could make things before the whole system became too unreliable, too expensive, too big. The integrated circuit shattered that limit. By putting everything on one chip, you eliminated most of the wiring, most of the failure points, and most of the size. And crucially, the manufacturing process was photographic in nature. You could use light to etch patterns onto silicon, which meant you could make the patterns smaller and smaller, fitting more and more transistors onto the same chip. This is where Gordon Moore enters the story. Moore was another one of the traitorous 8, a colleague of Noyce's at Fairchild. In 1965, he wrote an article for Electronics magazine in which he observed that the number of transistors on an integrated circuit had been doubling roughly every year, and he predicted that this trend would continue. He later revised the doubling period to about every 2 years. This observation became known as Moore's law, and it's not really a law of physics. It's more of an observation about the pace of engineering innovation. But it held true for decade after decade, with remarkable consistency. In 1971, Intel's first microprocessor, the 4004, had about 2,300 transistors. By the mid-2020s, cutting-edge chips contain over 100 billion. That's a factor of something like 40 million, achieved in just over 50 years. And every one of those doublings meant computers got faster, cheaper, smaller, and more capable. And Moore didn't just observe this trend, he helped drive it. Because in 1968, he and Robert Noyce left Fairchild and founded a new company. They called it Intel, short for Integrated Electronics. And Intel would become the company that put a computer on a single chip, the microprocessor. But the story of how that happened involves an unlikely request from a Japanese calculator company, a young engineer named Ted Hoff, who saw something no one else saw, and a design decision that would change the entire trajectory of the computer industry. So here's what happened. In 1969, a Japanese company called Busicom approached Intel with a contract. Busicom made desktop calculators, and they wanted Intel to design a set of custom chips for their next-generation calculator. The original plan called for something like 12 different chips, each one designed to handle a specific function, one for the keyboard input, one for the display, one for the printer control, one for the arithmetic, and so on. It was a perfectly reasonable approach. That's how custom electronics worked at the time. You figured out what your product needed to do, and you designed dedicated circuits to do each thing. But Ted Hoff, the Intel engineer assigned to the project, looked at this plan and had a different idea. Hoff had a background in computer architecture. He'd done his PhD at Stanford. And when he studied Busicom's specification, he realized that all those separate chips were essentially doing what a small, general-purpose computer could do with the right programming. Instead of building 12 specialized chips, why not build one chip that was a tiny, programmable processor, and then use software to tell it how to behave as a calculator? You'd store the instructions in memory, and the single processor would execute them step by step. just like the stored program computers we talked about earlier. The same principle that John von Neumann had described, the same idea behind the Manchester baby. Except now, the entire processor would fit on a single sliver of silicon. Think about what a radical shift that is. Instead of designing hardware for every specific task, you design one flexible piece of hardware and change its behavior through software. It's the difference between building a separate machine for every job and building one machine that can learn any job. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because it's essentially the idea of the universal machine that Turing described back in 1936. A single device that can simulate any other device, given the right instructions. Hopf probably wasn't thinking about Turing's paper when he sketched out his proposal, but the conceptual lineage is direct and beautiful. Now, Hopf's idea wasn't immediately popular. Busicom wanted their calculator chips, and Intel's management wasn't sure about diverting resources to build a general-purpose processor when the contract was for a specific product. But Hopf pushed for it, and eventually the project moved forward. The actual chip design was largely carried out by Federico Faggin, an Italian physicist and engineer who had joined Intel from Fairchild. Faggin was the one who turned the concept into working silicon, using a new process called silicon gate technology that he himself had helped develop at Fairchild. He worked incredibly long hours. By his own account, he was practically living at Intel during the design phase, and by early 1971, the chip was ready. They called it the Intel 4004. It was a 4-bit processor, meaning it could handle data 4 bits at a time. It ran at a clock speed of 740 kilohertz. That's less than 1 megahertz, which is almost comically slow by modern standards. Your phone's processor runs at something like 2 to 3 gigahertz, which is roughly 4,000 times faster, and that's before you account for all the other architectural improvements that multiply performance even further. The 4004 had those 2300 transistors we mentioned, and the entire chip was about the size of a fingernail. But here's what mattered. It was a real, programmable computer on a single chip. A microprocessor, the first commercially available one. Intel initially sold it as part of the Busicom calculator chipset, but they quickly realized that the real value wasn't in calculators. It was in the generality of the thing. They renegotiated the contract with Busicom, got back the rights to sell the 4004 for non-calculator applications, and in November 1971, they ran an ad in electronic news with the headline, announcing a new era of integrated electronics. And that wasn't hyperbole. It really was a new era. Because here's the thing about the microprocessor. It democratized computing in a way that nothing before it had. Before the 4004, if you wanted computing power, you bought a computer. Computers were big, expensive, and they lived in special rooms with raised floors and air conditioning and dedicated operators. Even mini-computers, which had started appearing in the 1960s thanks to companies like Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC's PDP-8, introduced in 1965, cost about $18,000, which was revolutionary at the time. Even those were still substantial machines that you had to plan around. But a microprocessor was just a component. It was a chip you could buy and put inside anything: a traffic light, a microwave oven, an elevator, a car engine, a toy. Anything that needed a little bit of intelligence could now have it, cheaply. And Intel didn't stop with the 4004. In 1972, they released the 8008, an 8-bit processor. Then in 1974, the 8080, which was much more capable and became the brain of one of the first personal computers. the Altair 8800, which showed up on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine in January 1975. The Altair was sold as a kit for about $400, and it was, honestly, barely usable by today's standards. It had no keyboard, no screen, just toggle switches on the front panel that you flipped to enter programs in binary, and a row of blinking lights that showed you the output. But it didn't matter. It was a computer, a real computer, and you could own one. You could have it in your house, on your desk. And this is where the story starts to accelerate in a way that's almost dizzying, because the Altair attracted the attention of two young men in particular whose names you definitely know. Bill Gates and Paul Allen saw that Popular Electronics cover and immediately wrote a version of the basic programming language for the Altair. They called their little partnership Microsoft, with a hyphen, which they later dropped. Meanwhile, out in California, a different set of things was happening. Steve Wozniak, a brilliant young engineer who worked at Hewlett-Packard by day, was a member of a hobbyist group called the Homebrew Computer Club that met in a garage in Menlo Park. Wozniak saw the Altair and thought he could do better. And he could. He designed the Apple I, a single-board computer that was far more elegant than the Altair, and his friend Steve Jobs, who had a very different kind of genius, a genius for seeing what technology could mean to ordinary people, convinced him they should sell it. They founded Apple Computer in 1976, famously working out of the Jobs family garage in Los Altos. The Apple II, released in 1977, was the machine that really changed things. It came in a plastic case. It had color graphics, it had a keyboard, and eventually it could run a spreadsheet program called VisiCalc that gave businesses a reason to buy personal computers. VisiCalc is one of those pieces of software that doesn't get enough credit. It was the first killer app. The application so useful that people bought the hardware just to run it. Suddenly, a personal computer wasn't a hobbyist toy. It was a business tool that could save you hours of work every week. And then IBM entered the personal computer market, and everything shifted again. IBM had been watching the microcomputer revolution with a mixture of curiosity and concern. They were the dominant force in mainframes and mini-computers, but this new personal computer thing was happening fast, and it was happening without them. So in 1980, IBM set up a small, semi-autonomous team in Boca Raton, Florida, and gave them about a year to build a personal computer. The team, led by Don Estridge, made a fateful decision. Instead of designing everything from scratch the way IBM usually did, they used off-the-shelf components. They chose Intel's 8088 processor, and for the operating system, they went to a small company in Seattle, Microsoft. Now, here's one of the most consequential deals in business history. IBM originally approached Digital Research, whose CP/M operating system was the standard for microcomputers at the time. But the meeting didn't go well. The exact details are disputed and have become the stuff of legend, with various accounts of missed meetings and unsigned non-disclosure agreements. Whatever happened, IBM ended up talking to Bill Gates instead. Microsoft didn't actually have an operating system to sell, but Gates knew of one, a CP/M clone called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System, written by a programmer named Tim Patterson at Seattle Computer Products. Microsoft bought the rights to QDOS for somewhere around $50,000 to $75,000, adapted it, and licensed it to IBM as PC-DOS. Here's the crucial detail. Microsoft retained the right to sell the operating system to other companies under the name MS-DOS. And that mattered enormously, because when the IBM PC launched in August 1981, it was a hit. And because IBM had used off-the-shelf parts and a non-proprietary architecture, other companies could build compatible machines. Compaq was the first to successfully reverse engineer the IBM PC's BIOS and produce a legal clone in 1982. Then came Dell, then dozens of others. The IBM PC became a standard, but IBM didn't control that standard the way they'd controlled the mainframe market. The real winners were Intel, who sold the processors, and Microsoft, who sold the operating system. Every clone needed both. IBM had accidentally created a platform that would outgrow them. So by the mid-1980s, you had this extraordinary situation. Personal computers were everywhere, in offices, in schools, starting to appear in homes. The graphical user interface was emerging, inspired by work done at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, in the 1970s. Xerox PARC is one of those places that deserves its own entire story. They invented or prototyped an astonishing number of things we now take for granted. The mouse, the graphical desktop with windows and icons, Ethernet networking, laser printing, object-oriented programming. But Xerox, a copier company at heart, famously failed to commercialize most of these inventions. It was Apple that took the graphical interface idea and ran with it, first with the Lisa in 1983, which was too expensive, and then with the Macintosh in 1984, which was more affordable and came with that famous Super Bowl commercial directed by Ridley Scott. And then Microsoft followed with Windows, which went through several rough early versions before Windows 3.0 in 1990 finally made it a viable product. But let's step back from the business drama for a moment and think about what was happening at a deeper level, because something profound was underway. Computing was shifting from being a tool that specialists used to being a medium that ordinary people interacted with directly. And that shift required not just faster hardware, but fundamentally new ways of thinking about how humans and computers communicate. The command line, that blinking cursor waiting for you to type precise instructions, was powerful but intimidating. The graphical interface, with its metaphor of a desktop and files and folders and a trash can, made the computer feel approachable. You didn't need to memorize commands. You could point at things and click on them. You could see your work laid out in front of you. And this is where something interesting happened with networking, because while personal computers were transforming what individuals could do, a parallel revolution was connecting those computers together, and the roots of that revolution go back further than most people realize, back to the Cold War, back to a question about how to build a communication network that could survive a nuclear attack. In the early 1960s, a researcher at the Rand Corporation named Paul Baran was thinking about exactly this problem. The existing telephone network was centralized. It had switching centers, and if you took out those centers, the whole network collapsed. Baran proposed something radically different, a distributed network with no central hub, where messages would be broken into small pieces, each piece finding its own route through the network independently and reassembling at the destination. He called this concept hot potato routing. Around the same time, completely independently, a British computer scientist named Donald Davies at the National Physical Laboratory came up with essentially the same idea and gave it the name we still use today, packet switching. These ideas converged in a project funded by the U.S. Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency. In 1969, ARPANET went live, connecting 4 universities, UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. The first message sent over ARPANET on October 29, 1969, was supposed to be the word login. But the system crashed after just 2 letters. So the first message ever transmitted over what would become the internet was simply "low," which is kind of perfect if you think about it. Humble, incomplete, a beginning that didn't quite work right. And from that stuttering start, something was growing that would eventually change the world in ways nobody standing in that UCLA lab could have imagined. By 1971, ARPANET had grown to about 15 nodes, and already people were finding uses for it that the designers hadn't anticipated. See, the original vision was about sharing expensive computing resources. The idea was that a researcher at one university could run a program on a more powerful computer at another university without having to physically travel there. That was the official justification, the reason the Department of Defense was writing the checks. But almost immediately, the people connected to this network discovered something else, something that turned out to be far more important than remote computing. They discovered that what they really wanted to do was talk to each other. In 1971, a programmer named Ray Tomlinson, working at the company Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, the same firm that had built the original ARPANET routing computers, wrote a simple program that let you send a message from one computer to another. Email. He's the one who chose the @ sign, that little symbol, to separate the user's name from the computer's name. He later said he chose it mostly because it was sitting there on the keyboard and nobody was using it for anything else. A small, almost arbitrary decision that became one of the most recognizable symbols on the planet. And here's the thing. Within a couple of years, email was the dominant use of ARPANET. Not remote computing, not file sharing, not any of the grand technical purposes that had justified the funding. Just people writing messages to each other, which tells you something profound about technology, right? You build a network for one reason, and humans immediately find a different reason to love it, and that different reason is almost always about connecting with other humans. Now, ARPANET was growing, but it wasn't the internet yet, not even close. And the distinction matters. ARPANET was one network run by one organization, using one specific set of protocols. But by the mid-1970s, other networks were springing up independently. There were radio-based networks, satellite networks, local area networks at universities and corporations. The problem was that these networks couldn't talk to each other. Each one spoke its own language, had its own rules for how data was formatted and transmitted. It was like having a dozen different telephone systems that couldn't connect. You could call anyone on your network, but you couldn't reach anyone on a different one. This is where two people enter the story who probably deserve to be far more famous than they are: Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. In 1973, they began working on a protocol, a set of rules, that would allow different networks to interconnect. Think about what that means for a second. They weren't just building a better network. They were building a way for networks to talk to other networks. A network of networks. And that, right there, is literally what the word internet means. Internetworking. The protocol they developed, published in 1974 and refined over the next several years, was called TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol, and it's elegant in its simplicity, at least conceptually. The Internet Protocol, IP, handles addressing. It gives every device on the network a unique number, an IP address, and it figures out how to route packets of data from one address to another. The Transmission Control Protocol, TCP, handles reliability. It makes sure all the packets arrive, that they arrive in the right order, and that nothing gets lost or corrupted along the way. If a packet goes missing, TCP notices and requests it again. Together, these two protocols create a system where any computer, on any network, anywhere in the world, can reliably exchange data with any other computer, as long as both are speaking TCP/IP. On January 1st, 1983, a date sometimes called Flag Day, ARPANET officially switched over to TCP/IP. Every connected machine had to adopt the new protocol simultaneously. It was a massive coordinated effort, and it worked. And that date, more than any other, is arguably when the Internet as we know it was truly born. Not when ARPANET first connected 4 universities, not when email was invented, but when the system adopted a universal language that allowed unlimited expansion. Because now, any new network anywhere in the world could join simply by adopting TCP/IP. There was no gatekeeper, no central authority deciding who could connect. You just had to speak the language. But here's what's fascinating. Even after this, the Internet was still mostly an academic and military tool. Your average person in 1985 had no idea it existed. The personal computer revolution was happening in parallel, remember? Millions of people had Apple IIs and IBM PCs and Commodore 64s on their desks. But those machines were mostly islands, standalone devices. Some people had modems and could dial into bulletin board systems, little local communities where you could post messages and download files. But that was a niche hobby. The Internet and the personal computer existed in separate worlds, and it took another invention to bring them crashing together. That invention came from an unlikely place, a physics laboratory in Switzerland. In 1989, a British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee was working at CERN, the European Particle Physics Lab near Geneva. CERN had thousands of researchers cycling through from universities all over the world, and they had a very practical problem. How do you share information among all these people using different computers, different operating systems, different document formats? Berners-Lee proposed something he initially called a mesh, a system where documents could be linked to other documents, so you could click on a reference and immediately jump to the related information, no matter where it was physically stored. He built 3 things that, together, created what we now call the World Wide Web. First, HTML, hypertext markup language, a simple way to format documents and create links between them. Second, HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol, the rules for how a browser requests a page and a server delivers it. And third, the URL, the Uniform Resource Locator, a standardized way to address any document anywhere on the web. He also built the first web browser and the first web server, running on a Next computer at CERN. And in a decision that might be the single most consequential act of generosity in the history of technology, CERN made the World Wide Web available to everyone, for free, with no licensing fees, no royalties, no restrictions. Think about what that means. They could have patented it, charged for it, controlled it. They didn't. They gave it away. The web went public in 1991, and at first growth was slow. The early web was text-only, academic, and frankly kind of ugly. But in 1993, a 22-year-old undergraduate at the University of Illinois named Mark Andreessen, working at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, released a web browser called Mosaic. And Mosaic changed everything because it did something deceptively simple. It put images and text together on the same page. It had a clean, intuitive graphical interface. It ran on Windows, on Mac, on Unix. It made the web feel like something a normal person could actually use. Andreessen later co-founded Netscape, which released Netscape Navigator in 1994, and the explosion began in earnest. The numbers are staggering. In 1993, there were roughly 130 websites in the entire world. By 1996, there were over 100,000. By 2000, there were more than 17 million. And behind each of those websites was a server, a computer running somewhere, connected to the internet, serving up pages to anyone who asked. The infrastructure had to scale at a pace that had no historical precedent. New fiber optic cables were being laid across ocean floors. New routing hardware was being built. New protocols were being developed for everything from streaming audio to secure financial transactions. And this is where the economic story gets wild, because the mid to late 1990s saw the rise of what we now call the dot-com bubble. The logic, or the perceived logic, was simple. The internet is going to change everything, so any company with a website and a business plan, or even without a business plan, must be worth a fortune. Venture capital flooded in. Companies with no revenue and no clear path to profitability were going public and seeing their stock prices double or triple on the first day of trading. Pets.com, Webvan, eToys, Cosmo.com, names that became punchlines later, but at the time were raising hundreds of millions of dollars. The Nasdaq Composite Index, heavy with tech stocks, climbed from about 1,000 in 1995 to over 5,000 by March of 2000, and then it collapsed. Between March 2000 and October 2002, the Nasdaq lost nearly 80% of its value. Trillions of dollars in paper wealth vanished. Companies that had been valued at billions simply ceased to exist. It was brutal, and a lot of people lost a lot of money, and a lot of real engineers lost real jobs. But here's the thing that's easy to miss when you're looking at the wreckage. The underlying technology didn't go away. The fiber optic cables were still in the ground. The protocols still worked. The servers were still humming. And some of the companies that survived the crash, Amazon, eBay, Google, emerged stronger than ever, leaner and more focused, and went on to become some of the most powerful corporations in human history. Google is worth pausing on for a moment, because the story captures something essential about how computing evolves. In 1996, two Stanford graduate students named Larry Page and Sergey Brin started working on a research project about how web pages link to each other. The web was growing so fast that finding anything useful was becoming genuinely difficult. Existing search engines ranked results based mostly on how many times a search term appeared on a page, which meant they were easy to manipulate and often returned garbage. Page and Brin had a different idea. What if you ranked pages based on how many other pages linked to them, and weighted those links by the importance of the linking pages? It was essentially applying the logic of academic citation. A paper cited by many important papers is probably important itself to the web. They called the algorithm PageRank, a pun on Larry Page's name, and it worked astonishingly well. Google launched in 1998 from a garage in Menlo Park, California. Because of course it was a garage, because the garage is practically a sacred space in Silicon Valley mythology. And within a few years, to Google had become a verb. But what made Google truly powerful wasn't just the search algorithm. It was the infrastructure they built to run it. To index the entire web and return results in fractions of a second, Google had to build enormous data centers filled with thousands of commodity servers, all running custom software that distributed the workload across machines and handled failures gracefully. They essentially invented a new way of doing large-scale computing, what we'd later call cloud computing, out of sheer necessity. And this brings us to something that would have seemed almost magical to those engineers huddled around ENIAC in 1945, or even to the team at Intel staring at the 4004 under a microscope in 1971. By the early 2000s, computing had become something you didn't just use, It was something you lived inside. It was in your pocket. It was in your car. It was mediating your friendships and your finances and your memories. And the next transformation was already underway, because in January 2007, a man in a black turtleneck walked onto a stage in San Francisco and said something that would change everything. "Today," Steve Jobs told the crowd, "Apple is going to reinvent the phone." And the thing is, he wasn't exaggerating. He really wasn't. The device he pulled out, the iPhone, wasn't the first smartphone. That's worth saying clearly. BlackBerry had been around for years. Palm had its Treo. Nokia had internet-capable phones. Windows Mobile existed. But what Jobs did that day was something different. He took a phone, a widescreen iPod, and an internet communicator, his words, and he merged them into a single device with a multi-touch screen and no physical keyboard. And the audience laughed and cheered when he revealed that these weren't three separate products. They were one thing. One small, beautiful, glass and aluminum thing that fit in your hand. Now let's talk about what actually made the iPhone revolutionary from an engineering perspective, because it wasn't any single technology. Almost every component inside it already existed in some form. Multi-touch screens had been researched for decades. You can trace that lineage back to work at the University of Toronto in the early 1980s, and there were multi-touch tables and surfaces in various labs. ARM processors had been powering mobile devices for years. Accelerometers, proximity sensors, ambient light sensors, all known quantities. What Apple did was integrate all of these into a package that felt effortless to use. And that word, integration, is actually the thread that runs through this entire story we've been telling tonight, isn't it? From Kilby squeezing components onto a single chip, to Noyce refining the process, to the microprocessor, putting an entire computer on a sliver of silicon. Integration over and over again, making the complex feel simple, making the many become one. The iPhone shipped in June 2007, and it sold about 6 million units in its first year. Those are impressive numbers, but they don't capture the real revolution. The real revolution came a year later, in July 2008, when Apple launched the App Store. And this is where it gets interesting, because the App Store wasn't just a software distribution platform. It was an ecosystem. Suddenly, any developer anywhere in the world could write a piece of software, submit it, and have it available to millions of people within days. Think about what that means compared to the software distribution model of even 10 years earlier, when you'd buy a shrink-wrapped box at a store, take it home, and install it from a CD-ROM. The friction just evaporated, and the result was an explosion of creativity that nobody, not even Apple, fully anticipated. Within a year, there were tens of thousands of apps. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands. Games, productivity tools, social networks, health trackers, music creation apps, banking apps. Your phone became a camera, a map, a compass, a level, a flashlight, a boarding pass, a wallet. Each of those functions used to require a separate physical object, and now they all lived in one device in your pocket. Google, of course, saw this coming. They'd actually acquired a small company called Android Inc. back in 2005, and by late 2008, the first Android phone, the HTC Dream, also called the T-Mobile G1, hit the market. Android took a different approach than Apple. Where Apple controlled both the hardware and the software, keeping everything tightly integrated, Google made Android open source and let any manufacturer use it. Samsung, HTC, LG, Motorola, They could all build Android phones. This echoed something we talked about much earlier tonight, that split between the IBM PC's open architecture, spawning an entire clone ecosystem, and Apple's closed approach with the Macintosh. History was rhyming, and just like in the PC era, the open approach captured the larger market share. Today, Android runs on something like 75% of the world's smartphones, but Apple, with its tighter integration, captures a disproportionate share of the profits. Same pattern, different decade. Here's the thing about smartphones that's easy to overlook because we're so immersed in it now. The smartphone didn't just change how we use computers, it changed who uses computers. Before the iPhone and Android, personal computing was largely a phenomenon of the developed world. You needed a desktop or laptop, a reliable power supply, an internet connection. But mobile phones could go anywhere. Cell towers are cheaper to deploy than wired broadband infrastructure. And as smartphone prices dropped, especially on the Android side, where manufacturers competed fiercely on price, billions of people who had never owned a computer suddenly had one in their hands. By 2015, there were more than 2 billion smartphone users worldwide. By the early 2020s, that number had passed 6 billion. 6 billion. Think about that in the context of our story tonight. We started with the Ishango bone, a single tally stick in Central Africa, maybe 20,000 years old. And now there are 6 billion interconnected computing devices in human hands, each one millions of times more powerful than the machines that filled entire rooms in the 1940s. That trajectory is just staggering. But let's slow down for a moment, because there's a quieter revolution happening alongside the smartphone that deserves attention. Remember how we talked about Google building those massive data centers to power their search engine? That infrastructure, thousands of servers working together, managed by clever software, became the foundation for something much bigger. Amazon, of all companies, was the one that really commercialized it. In 2006, Amazon launched Amazon Web Services, or AWS, and the key offering was something called Elastic Compute Cloud, EC2. The idea was beautifully simple. Instead of buying and maintaining your own servers, you could rent computing power from Amazon by the hour. Need 10 servers for a day to handle a traffic spike? Spin them up, use them, shut them down, pay only for what you used. This was cloud computing made practical, and it changed the economics of starting a technology company overnight. Suddenly, a couple of founders with a good idea didn't need to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for server hardware before writing a line of code. They could start for almost nothing and scale up as they grew. Instagram, when it launched in 2010 and gained 1 million users in 2 months, was running on AWS. So was Airbnb. So was Netflix's streaming service. The cloud made it possible for tiny teams to build services that reached millions of people because the hard problem of infrastructure had been abstracted away. And this idea of abstraction, it keeps coming back, doesn't it? It's one of the deepest ideas in all of computing. You build a layer, you make it reliable, and then you stop thinking about it and build the next layer on top. Transistors abstracted away vacuum tubes. Integrated circuits abstracted away individual transistors. Operating systems abstracted away hardware specifics. High-level programming languages abstracted away machine code. The internet abstracted away the physical network. The web abstracted away the internet's raw protocols. The cloud abstracted away physical servers. Each layer lets the next generation of builders focus on higher-level problems. It's like geology, in a way. Layers of sediment compressing into rock, and each new layer rests on everything below it without needing to know the details of how that bedrock formed. So by the early 2000s, you had this extraordinary convergence. Billions of people connected through smartphones, vast cloud computing infrastructure available to anyone, and more data being generated every day than in entire previous centuries of human civilization combined. And that convergence set the stage for the resurgence of an idea that had been kicking around since the very earliest days of computing: artificial intelligence. Now, AI is a term that gets thrown around so loosely today that it's worth grounding it a little. The dream of thinking machines goes back at least to Turing. Remember his 1936 paper, the one that imagined a universal machine? By 1950, Turing was explicitly asking the question, can machines think? He proposed what we now call the Turing test. If a human, communicating with a machine through text, can't reliably tell whether they're talking to a person or a computer, then maybe, in some meaningful sense, the machine is thinking. The field of artificial intelligence was formally born in 1956 at a summer workshop at Dartmouth College, organized by John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, and a few others. They were wildly optimistic. They genuinely believed that within a generation, machines would be able to do anything a human mind could do. That didn't happen, of course. AI went through cycles of hype and disappointment, periods researchers ruefully call AI winters, where funding dried up because the promises outran the reality. The fundamental problem was that the early approaches, which relied on hand-coded rules and logic, couldn't handle the messy complexity of the real world. You could build a system that played checkers well, but you couldn't build one that could look at a photograph and tell you whether it contained a cat. The world was just too complicated to capture in explicit rules. What changed everything was a combination of three things that all came together in the 2000s. First, data. Oceans of it, generated by billions of internet users. Second, computing power. Specifically, the discovery that graphics processing units, GPUs, originally designed to render video game graphics, were extraordinarily good at the kind of parallel mathematical operations that a particular type of AI called neural networks required. And third, algorithmic breakthroughs, particularly a technique called deep learning, which involves neural networks with many layers that can learn increasingly abstract representations of data. The ideas behind neural networks weren't new. The basic concept dates back to the 1940s, and a technique called backpropagation, which lets neural networks learn from their errors, was developed in the 1980s. But without enough data and enough computing power, these networks couldn't do much. When all three ingredients finally came together, the results were dramatic. In 2012, a deep neural network called AlexNet, built by Alex Krzyzewski, Ilya Sutskever, and Geoffrey Hinton at the University of Toronto, won the ImageNet competition, a benchmark for image recognition, by a margin that shocked the field. It wasn't incrementally better than previous approaches. It was dramatically better. And from that moment, deep learning swept through AI like a wave. Within a few years, neural networks were matching or exceeding human performance at image recognition, speech recognition, language translation, and game playing. In 2016, a system called AlphaGo, built by DeepMind in London, defeated Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players in history, in a 5-game match. Go is a game so complex that there are more possible board positions than atoms in the observable universe. For decades, experts had said that mastering Go was decades away for computers. AlphaGo did it by training on millions of games and then playing against itself millions more times, developing strategies that human players had never seen in thousands of years of play. And then came the large language models. In 2017, researchers at Google published a paper called "Attention is All You Need," introducing a neural network architecture called the transformer. It was designed for processing sequences of text, and it turned out to be extraordinarily powerful. By training transformer models on vast amounts of text from the internet, billions of words, essentially a significant fraction of everything humanity has ever written, these models learn to generate coherent, contextually appropriate language. GPT-2, released by OpenAI in 2019, could write passable essays and stories. GPT-3 in 2020 was dramatically more capable. And by late 2022, when OpenAI released ChatGPT, the world suddenly realized that something fundamental had shifted. Here was a system you could have a conversation with, ask questions, request explanations, even ask to write code or poetry, and it would respond in ways that felt, well, remarkably human. Now, here's where I want to be careful, because this is still an evolving story and it's easy to get swept up in either utopian excitement or dystopian fear. What these large language models do is genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. They're the product of decades of research, staggering amounts of computation, and clever architectural decisions. But they're also, at their core, sophisticated pattern matching systems trained on human-generated text. They don't understand the world the way you and I do. They can produce text that sounds deeply knowledgeable while being subtly or even completely wrong. The engineering challenges that remain, making these systems reliable, truthful, safe, and fair, are enormous and genuinely hard. But step back for a moment. Just breathe and think about the arc of the story we've traveled tonight. From notches carved into bone, from beads sliding on rods, from a young mathematician in 9th century Baghdad writing down procedures for solving equations and inadvertently giving us the word algorithm, from Babbage's dream of a machine that could be programmed with punched cards, and Ada Lovelace's insight that such a machine could do more than arithmetic, from Turing, sitting alone with his thoughts, imagining a universal machine on paper, and then, just a few years later, helping to break codes that changed the course of a war. From rooms full of vacuum tubes to a transistor you could barely see. From a chip with a few dozen components to one with billions. From 4 computers connected on ARPANET to billions of devices woven into a global web. From a search engine in a garage to artificial intelligence that can hold a conversation. Each step along the way, someone looked at the current state of things and thought, what if we could do this differently? What if we could do this better? And they tried, and sometimes they failed spectacularly, and sometimes they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. And the machine they were all building, collectively, across centuries and continents, without any of them fully seeing the whole picture, that machine is the world you live in now. It's the device that might be playing this very recording. It's the network that delivered it to you. It's the layers upon layers of abstraction, each one a human achievement, stacked so high that no single person alive today understands all of it. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing of all. Computing, this vast cathedral of logic and electricity and human ingenuity, has grown beyond any one mind's ability to comprehend it entirely. And yet, it works. It works because each generation built carefully on what came before, because standards were agreed upon, because failures were studied and learned from, because somewhere, someone always cared enough to get the details right. So as you lie there, maybe drifting in and out, maybe already half asleep, just let that thought settle. You're resting in a world shaped by all of these people and all of these ideas. The bone carver, and the bead slider, and the loom weaver, and the code breaker, and the chip maker, and the network builder. They're all part of the same long story. And it's still being written, but that's for tomorrow. For now, the story can wait. The machines will keep humming quietly in their data centers. The signals will keep bouncing between satellites and towers and undersea cables. The bits will keep flowing. And you don't need to think about any of it. You can just rest and breathe and let it all go quiet. The story will be there when you wake up. It always is.